order of events here. This panel starts 15:55, which is 20 minutes ago. So this is pretty clever. But obviously we foresaw this. This is alternative futures. We're divining the future, what's going to happen. So the universe is carefully arranged that out of the 5 planned speakers we had for this panel, 3 of them are here and 2 of them unfortunately have COVID. Which means that we can get back on track. But so bear with us while we do that. So that's why there's only 3 people here, but I'm sure they have amazing things to say. So that's good. And it also means that we have a bit more time to hear from everybody here. So that's something that while we're talking in the initial part of the panel here, have a think about any things that you have that relate to this. So we've been hearing a lot today from clinicians, therapists, investors, people from religious backgrounds, all sorts of different sort of particular things. What we want to do in this session is to look at the emotional aspects of what's happening now. I've asked the panelists here to talk about alternative futures from 2 perspectives. I've asked them to think about the future that they most dread, that might be most likely to happen, the one that they fear the most, the one that they want to move away from, and also the future that they want to move towards, the one that they desire to happen the most. And within this framework, I'm not allowing a future that doesn't have psychedelics in it. I don't think that's going to happen. So we're assuming that psychedelics are in this world of the future. So it's what do we fear most, what do we desire most? And then the subsidiary things for those 2 particular areas that we're going to try and look at is what will make these things happen? So how can we hopefully avoid things that we fear, and what things would make things manifest that we want to happen? And that's the way that we're going to structure this. But first of all, I'd like to introduce or ask the people to introduce themselves with how did they arrive here on this stage with us? I'll leave you for a moment, Ali, because you've been doing a lot of talking in the last session. So, Gabriel, I think I'll start with you.
First, yeah.
So if you could just spend a few minutes about your journey to this seat on the stage here. Why are you here?
I don't know. I hate starting. You don't have an example before. Okay, so I am Gabriel. I am a Mexican anthropologist. I am specialized in ritualistic use of psychedelic substances. I am also the co-founder of the first harm reduction organization of Mexico. I have been working for the last 15 years with everything that has to do with drugs, with psychoactive substances. Basically, how I got here is through walking this path precisely of, okay, first harm reduction, understanding harm reduction when I was young, when I was going to parties, and then from there starting to do drug checking, and I was doing drug checking at festivals. And then I started doing psych-care. And when doing psych-care, I started becoming really interested in psychedelic substances. So I started studying anthropology. And I started really focusing in shamanism and ritual studies. After that, I started becoming a little bit more interested in also therapeutic uses. And little by little, I also started becoming radically political, realizing that actually everything has to do with politics. And actually, I'm a little bit impressed because I have this sensation since I arrived here that this has been a very narrow discussion at least in the political way. I mean, everything that we're talking about right now is submitted to a political context. That we're talking about illegal substances. And everyone is talking about them like, oh yeah, and we're going to medicalize them and it's going to be great. And it's like, what? What are you talking about? These are illegal substances. We can't do proper edge-cutting research, I'm sorry, Ben, with illegal substances. I mean, we are constrained, our limitations are so massive. My idea, I mean, the reason why I'm here is because the past 3 years I've been doing consultancies for the Open Society Foundation, for MAPS, for hedge funds investing in psychedelic substances. When I was working with Open Society Foundation, I was doing research about the potential of psychedelic substances to help vulnerable populations, mental health in vulnerable populations, sexual abuse, cultural, racial trauma, a lot of different processes and problems. And of course, always the problem came back to the same thing. These are illegal substances. How the fuck? I also love the F word, I'm sorry. How are we gonna make edge-cutting research if we are so limited in the capability that we have? So first of all, I mean, do you want to do edge-cutting research? Then let's do this a political fight. We need to decriminalize psychedelics.
Yes.
And so, edge-cutting research. I don't know. What about Icarus? What about researching the power of Icarus in shamanistic studies? Or what about group therapy? Or what about couples therapy with psychedelics? I mean, there is so much to explore, and we can't actually properly explore it because we're constrained to a very specific ambient, the therapeutic, one-to-one, psychiatric, hospitalic ambient. So, I'm sorry, I'm sometimes going to invent words because I tend to do that. So yeah, and of course, if we're going to talk about politics, if we're going to talk about decriminalization, and I'm going to mostly talk about that, I'm sorry, then we need to talk about the other topic that is completely related to that, which is harm reduction. I mean, we can't decriminalize if we don't assume harm reduction as an alternative method to prohibition, which is incredibly anchored and rooted in our system and culture. So we need to create drug education systems. We need to provide drug checking services. I've seen from first-hand experience during 7 years of working in harm reduction and drug education in festivals, I've seen young people who were completely wasted coming to my stand like, I'm so high in LSD and 2CB and giving them information, and the next year coming being, like a 19-year-old guy, like completely empowered, like, oh, thank you, man. Like since last year, I checked these pamphlets that you gave me, and I started doing research about psychedelics, and now I know how to take and the dosification and what not to mix. People who want to take drugs love information. The idea that people who take drugs are going to just throw themselves into the abyss is fucking ridiculous. They want information, so let's empower that process. And yeah, that's how I arrived here. Sorry.
Thank you. I suspect for many of us the story is equally like curvy and twisty. So thank you very much. Hattie, could I ask you to explain how you came to be sitting in this chair today? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Nikki, and thank you, Gabriel. I think I have an ally. We're allies, definitely, because I've been sitting here thinking the same thing, like nobody's talking about politics, nobody's talking about the law and the need for legal change. We're sort of stuck in one trajectory, and everyone's thinking, this is the way forward, and we're not looking at any alternative, and we're sort of criticizing this medical model without looking at alternatives, one of which, in terms of widening access would be decriminalization, basically. That's sort of first port of call. But how I came to be here, I'm director of Breaking Convention, and I've had a kind of, a sort of colorful patchwork of a psychedelic career that started with academic research and then kind of went into personal psychonautic research and a personal healing journey. I then became an ibogaine treatment provider for many years. And then I took a break, and I was also organizing conferences and disseminating information about ibogaine. Then I took a break, became a mum, and my first job back at work from being a mum was in drug policy reform. So I've been very focused on how we're going to change the laws and what we need to do, what kind of legal future we need to be looking at. But since then, in the last few years, I've wanted to get away from the desk and back into practical work. And so I'm now working on clinical trials as a psychedelic guide, which is a kind of unusual point to arrive at. But as an anthropological experience, it's, you know, super interesting. I'm kind of on the inside of this now, and I've obviously woven from, you know, much as we've seen the scene happening, moving from the underground to the overground, that's been happening in my career context. So this whole idea of worlds colliding, these worlds are colliding inside of myself, you know, and these points of tension that we're all talking about, they're happening inside of myself. I think for the last couple of years, this is kind of relevant. I've been working with a Spanish NGO called ICEAS, great Spanish NGO that are normally here representing themselves. And I've been working with Geronimo Mazarasa and also in kind of a lot of conversation with Andrea Langlois, who I presented here at BC last year on the issue of what makes good medicine, that kind of focused on reciprocity and sustainability. And the project I was tasked with, how many minutes have I got, Nikki?
3 or 4.
Okay.
If you want.
Okay. So the project I was tasked with was how to best legally integrate plant psychedelics into countries outside of their origin. And that then became, very quickly, how to best legally and ethically integrate plant psychedelics into countries outside of their origin. Because when you're talking about plant psychedelics, you're looking at the traditional context and the indigenous cultures, you can't possibly avoid ethics. And so I started by looking at legal reform around the world and looking at cannabis reform, particularly in the States and Canada, and asking a number of people who are deeply immersed in this field, both in cannabis and psychedelics, like what's worked with legal reform and what hasn't. What's been the upswing, what's been the downswing, who's benefited and who's been harmed. And what's your kind of utopian and dystopian vision? And that is obviously going to be discussed a bit here, like what are we afraid of and what are we excited about and what are we hopeful for? But the one thing that came out of all my research and the main thing that I kind of focused in on is that in legalizing in the States and Canada, we were just tearing down one set of restrictions and putting in another in its place. The freedom we all thought was going to happen didn't. And I know it's all relative because in comparison to here, they've got a lot of freedom. I mean, it's great, people aren't going to jail. But what I noticed was multiple barriers to access, both to the product, both to the cannabis and cannabis therapies, and to the industry. And that people were telling me that in the end, actually, the product you were getting was higher priced, lower quality, and harder to find. And the industry was really hard to access because of legal obstacles, financial obstacles, so only certain people were getting in. Big businesses, basically. People with lots of money. So what's kind of ended up is the people that were involved in cannabis for years have been sort of sidelined, the really experienced growers, and the people that knew more about business have profited. And the end result is that the patient or the customer is getting a lower quality product. And I think we can learn a lot from that in the cannabis world, in seeing who's able to enter the legal sphere. And at the moment, we're just going down the medical trajectory. And, you know, to be a pharmaceutical company, you need millions, if not billions of pounds, which will leave the kind of dominance of the market and the sphere in the hands of big business people and people with lots of money that tend to be, you know, white and privileged and from a certain area of the world. And I think we really need to address that. We need to sort of change that trajectory because we can't ignore the fact that we've had 50 years of a drug war, let alone 500 years of colonization and religious persecution, and certain cultures and cultural populations have been massively impacted and imprisoned by all this. And then look, just as we sort of open the doors to legal reform, they're not benefiting, we are.
Thank you, Hattie. Ali, if I could ask you to introduce yourself, please.
Yes, so I'm Alexander Beiner. I'm along with Nikki and Hattie, one of the directors of Breaking Convention. And I suppose that, to answer the question, how did I get onto this particular panel? I mean, obviously drive my way on, I became interested in psychedelics when I was sort of in my first year of university. Became interested in them because they were deeply sacred experience to me, but I also became very interested in the the ideas around psychedelics, the academia, the ideas of people like Terence McKenna, Timothy Leary, etc., and really the philosophy of psychedelics in some ways. And then over the years, I sort of, even though I had a foot in, I kind of became disillusioned a little bit. So I was very passionate about the idea that psychedelics can change culture. They can change the cultural game we're playing. And then, I was one of the founders of an organization called Rebel Wisdom. We explore sort of the cutting edge of philosophy, psychology, systems change, trying to make sense of what's going on in this incredibly strange era we're living in, where the stakes are higher than they've ever been, and asking what is the role of transformative practices in that? How can we reframe our conception of who we are and really start playing a new game? And then a couple of years ago, sort of at the beginning of COVID, psychedelic capitalism sort of exploded. And that's what really got me thinking in a new way about really about this idea again of could psychedelics change culture? And in a way, it was a reaction against what I was seeing, where and we are still seeing this, where psychedelics are going into the mainstream in such a way that they are, in one aspect, there will always be an underground, there will always be sacred expressions of it. But in terms of the main cultural narrative, they're becoming a part of the culture rather than something that challenges the culture. And I think what we need is something that radically challenges the culture, because otherwise we're all going to die, basically. And that took me on a whole rabbit hole. And something Hattie just said really resonated with me, of this kind of, these worlds are colliding in ourselves. I very much feel that. I feel like I've been wrestling with this question of psychedelic mainstreaming for a few years now. I found out recently that Plato was originally a wrestler. And this idea of wrestling with ideas, I think, is what's very exciting about these kinds of gatherings, is that there's no simple answers to these questions. One thing I'm particularly interested in, so I made a few sort of short documentaries and a number of articles exploring this, and trying to explore the complexity of what mainstreaming means, and can we keep this countercultural dream alive, that psychedelics could lead, not by themselves, but a more psychedelic culture could actually transform the game we're playing. And I think they can, but it's incredibly complex, and it actually requires all of us. It requires, they are not magically going to do it themselves. We all have to be in a kind of synergistic relationship with them, which I think is the way, in my experience, psychedelics heal in the first place. We work with them. So, and I think one of the big fallacies that's come about is this idea of the psychedelic Trojan horse, which is, well, we'll sneak the psychedelics into the culture through medical respectability, and we'll do clinical trials, and everyone will stop being weird, and we'll downplay the challenging aspects where they challenge the culture and the way we're living. And once they're medicalized, they will somehow magically spread through culture, and everyone will be enlightened. It's bollocks, basically. And the reason it doesn't work is because with psychedelics, in my view, the horse itself, the Trojan horse, is as important as what's inside it. Because the story we tell around psychedelics changes the experience we have. It changes our conception of it, and it changes how we use it. So we have to think about that cultural story as well. We have to wrestle with it, basically. And so that I'm still in a kind of a process of inquiry with it, as I think we all are to some degree. What does it actually look like for psychedelics to change culture? And I think there's a real risk that they go the way of yoga and meditation, where they become captured by it, and we get this sort of headspace version of psychedelia, which I'll maybe save for our dystopic visions of the future. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Hattie. So one of the people that should be here that isn't is Rick Doblin. I think we can probably guess what his ideal version of the future is. I think Ozon in the last panel managed to describe quite well the MAPS public benefit company and the research company, and all of the way that hopefully will unfold and then be be a model for people to copy throughout the planet, which is, I think, sums up probably what Rick would have said here. But the other person that should have been here is Leonie Schneider, who's part of the SaiPan network, and she was a patient in a clinical trial. And I don't want to speak for her. However, one of the things that I was hoping that she would bring to this discussion is the way that, and this is something that we've talked about when I talked to her personally, is that she described how, as patients in clinical trials, one of the horriblest things that happens for these people is that they have this, they've had depression, they can't shake it off. They go to a clinical trial and they're given psilocybin and it works. And then the trial finishes and that's it. And they don't have access to future. And for some people, this has led them to a place where they're actually like in not a worse state because they have had some but it's psychologically, it's very difficult to come to the terms with the fact that they know experientially that there is a treatment that will help them and they cannot access it because it's illegal to prescribe it to them. And that in itself is like, oh, that's a really sobering thought. So I just wanted to place that there for everybody.
Just leave it. I don't know how to make it stop.
Does it stop? Is it on? Thank you. So that's our introduction bit. That was what that beepy sound meant. So that's good. Well timed, everybody. So now we're going to go into the next part of it, where I'm going to ask people to go round. I think we'll do this in like 2 bits. So first of all, I'll talk about the dystopian, the thing that we fear. So our nightmare vision of what might happen in the next 5 to 10 years, that sort of, it's hard to tell because everything is shifting so quickly. The first Breaking Convention was only 11 years ago, and it's mad that it's changed so much in that time. The psychedelic research and the culture and the public conversation. Netflix are making about to show a series about psychedelic. Anyway, that would not have happened 11 years ago. Netflix didn't even exist then. So if things change rapidly, so with that in mind, in the sort of next 5, 10 years, I want to ask the panel to have a few minutes just to say what they fear most might happen, what's the most likely thing to happen that they fear, and what's causing that, so that we can then look at not just what they fear, but how we might, as collectively or individually, be able to change that future so that it doesn't happen. I'm going with that as our start question. Yeah. So, did you want to go first, Hattie, or?
Oh.
It's an option. So yeah.
Okay, there's many things I'm fearing, actually. I mean, I sort of, a few years ago when I started this project I just discussed, I would say I had an equal measure of sort of hope and fear around what's happening with the psychedelic renaissance. You know, before I go into the fear, I do just want to say there is a lot of hope and a lot of excitement, because I have seen over the last few years, you know, the complete, almost, not complete, but significant destigmatization of these compounds as a result of the science that's taken place. And we've done quite a lot of clinic, I don't want to say, well, I'm going to say it, clinic bashing, or sort of, you know, criticizing of this model, but, you know, it is opening a field, it's opening medical treatments, it's destigmatizing compounds. It's the first time in my life where I can get up and talk about what I do without any kind of fear of anyone walking away from me, you know, even at the school gate. And that's kind of incredible. But at the same time, you know, obviously there is a big shadow or multiple shadows looming on the horizon. And I think psychedelics show us, you know, personal use of psychedelics is all about confronting those shadows. And maybe what we're not doing well enough is confronting them as a field, you know, as a whole. Although I think what we're starting to do here is a sign of that, and it is starting to happen. There's more and more critique. But yeah, I think it's worth really trying to face them and integrate them rather than run from them. So my first big fear is obviously the kind of over-medicalization and over-corporatization of psychedelics, which we seem to be on that trajectory, which would mean that the only way you can access these is through clinics that operate in a certain way that have been regulated. And although Ben said earlier, well, everyone's going to keep doing psychedelics, there'll still be raves, there'll still be people tripping in fields, there'll still be mushrooms in Wales. The fact is, if you do any of that, you risk going to prison, or you risk being, you risk some sort of criminal charge. So the only way we're going to look at legal access is through this medical route. And what I'm afraid of with the medical route is just the high price and the exclusivity of it. It costs $1 billion to bring a psychedelic medicine to market. And it takes 15 or 20 years, it takes years. And so obviously to do that, you need a whole range of investors, all of whom are very interested in making a lot of profit. Otherwise, they wouldn't put the money in. And what I worry with that is that in the process of sort of thinking about profit over purpose, although there are some companies in the space that are trying to balance it, and there are B Corps, and that's really great, and we should be applauding them. But when you do this, you are kind of forced, when you go down the profit route, you're sort of forced to cut corners as you scale up. And we're already beginning to see this a bit. Like David spoke about the imperial trials, and I think it's very different in academic institutions. There's a sort of cozy team and a lovely room, and there's a supportive container. But as we scale up and go into clinical research organizations, you're just a ward in a drug trial clinic, and it becomes a little bit more like a conveyor belt, people in and out, and the container, not only for the patient, but for the guides and the whole team, is not really there. And obviously people are looking at, how can we minimize the time needed? How can we minimize the presence of therapists? We're going to go down from 2 to 1. We might go down from 8 hours to 4 hours. And then eventually we're going to go down the route, and this is the dystopian view, which I think, Ali, you just alluded to, of no therapists and just an app. And this is what someone else earlier mentioned, Mind Bloom with the ketamine. You got it's $1,200, I think. You get 4 sessions of ketamine delivered through your door as a dissolvable pill. You have an app, you have an hour, you have a couple of integration sessions, and a couple of preparation sessions, and a couple of integration sessions, and your playlist is sent to you, and that's your therapy. And when we're looking at what causes a lot of mental ills, we're finding in the science, and I think, all of us probably know, it's disconnection, loneliness, alienation. And it seems to me that the business model is taking the therapy in that direction. It's a very individualized approach. You're on your own, in a room, with your app and your computer and your pill, and that's going to be it. We've completely missed the point of connection and community in this medical model. And I don't know, I think we need to start talking more about that, how we can bring that in. And people have alluded to group therapy and doing more group work, and obviously you've got integration sessions set up and people are connecting in that way. But I fear that because of this sort of profit motivation, we're just going further and further and further down that road. Have I got 56 seconds left?
Sorry, I won't jump in and throw you off stage. So.
Well, my other fear that I just want to put out there, there's loads, I could probably talk for an hour on this, but my other fear is obviously the cultural appropriation and commodification of indigenous cultural practices that we've been doing for centuries, that we just look to be doing in a similar way, although not so obviously. But we have a very clear understanding and awareness of a lineage of knowledge that has come from traditional cultures. And even though people can say, well, we got LSD, we got psilocybin, mushrooms are growing everywhere, no one was interested in magic mushrooms until Gordon Wasson went off and did the Veleda with Maria Sabina and published the article in Life. And after that, all the psychedelic therapists that were working with mescaline and LSD, let's not forget mescaline we knew about because of the peyote use from traditional people, but suddenly everyone was interested in mushrooms. There's multiple patents out on mushrooms, over 50, I don't know what the latest figure is, on psilocybin, and not one of those companies is engaged in any meaningful reciprocity and giving back to the cultures from whom we learnt this knowledge. Time's up. Lots more, but...
Thank you very much, Hattie. That's really important things to raise there, and I'm sure we'll return to that in the discussion.
It's okay.
Would you like to go next, Gabriel?
Why
Gabriel?
not? Wow. Hello. Yes.
You have to speak into the end.
Wow. So yeah, I mean, it's not going to be easy to say something specifically different to what you said, because I completely agree with you. But yeah, something I do want to put my finger on is that, like Ben was talking about, that the underground psychedelic use will continue. Who's the underground? I mean, us, or like they or us? Because, I mean, from my perspective, I mean, 99.9% of psychedelic use doesn't happen in clinical settings, doesn't happen in your consultancy or in your therapeutic environment, not even in your retreat center. It happens in the dance floor, it happens in the living room of your best friend, it happens in that reality, and that's actually the part that we are not addressing at all. So what you say about over-medicalization, I mean, I will never attack medicalization, and I will never attack the efforts made by fantastic scientists doing research. Like, I really respect your job, like, it's amazing. The problem is the focus of medicalization only, because there are so many other ways of taking psychedelics than the medical way. And these ones are the ones that we're not paying attention towards. Like, how do we create a proper environment for them? And medicalization also has this topic that I studied a lot when I specialized in medical anthropology, which is called cognitive colonization, which is this idea that all the things that we're saying about how these things work are real, but actually they are culturally focused in ourselves, in our reality. So, for example, the pathogenetic perspective, I mean, you were talking about that before, like the problem of diagnose-only approach. You know, like, okay, who's going to be able to access psychedelics? People who are diagnosed. Diagnose is fucked up, I'm sorry, but it is. I mean, my wife is a psychologist, and she's every year she's telling me, like, okay, yeah, they added these new disorders, and they took out these ones, and they merged these ones, and it's like, what is that? I mean, is that rough science? Do you really think that's hard science? I mean, it is not. And as Ashley said, like, this is a constantly evolving field, and that's fantastic. But then we also need to start focusing in all the other derivations of the uses and the possibilities of psychedelic medicine, and, well, precisely not psychedelic medicine, of psychedelic use. Salutogenesis. I was working for a while with Henrik, who's now the director of Mind Foundation, and we were talking a lot about this idea, you know, like salutogenesis. Rolf Beres, he's basically a German scholar who brought this idea, like, okay, why are we only focused in healing diseases? Why are we not focusing in sustaining health? Why are we not focusing in telling people how to sustain a good quality of life before they get ill? And the reason why this is also a massively political topic is because mental health illnesses and disorders, they mostly come from a disruptive society, a society that is completely fucked up and fragmented. I mean, when I was studying with the Kashinawa people, they don't even have a concept of mental health. The Huichol people either, the Lakota people either. They don't have this concept. What they see mental health as social isolation. Mostly for them, they have this concept that is called panema, which is like the kind of like sickness of the soul. And how panema usually begins for them is mostly with people that are being isolated, people that can't generate proper connections with other people, people that are too centered in accumulation, in materialism, in egolatric perspectives of life. And this is exactly where we live. We live in a world of accumulation, success. I mean, so many of the people that I know working in the psychedelic field are obsessed with their own career. I don't even see so much of like a serving attitude or a sacred attitude, like, oh yes, I want to work for psychedelics because psychedelics are amazing. Bullshit. I mean, so many people are there because, oh, I'm shining. And I know that it's enticing. It is. It is really enticing to be the pioneer of a fantastic field. But that shouldn't be the focus. The focus is to serve people, is to help people. And to help people, we need to radically change the system, because mental health doesn't come from individual chemical processes. It comes from a society that doesn't know how to handle social relations, that doesn't know how to handle the future of people, the emotionality of people. I have 30 seconds, shit. I mean, the same. Something that I want to add about this is like, corporativism. You know, like so many people here were talking about like, oh yeah, but we have a good intention. You know, Airbnb also had a good intention. I haven't known any corporation person who doesn't have a good intention. Most of the corporative people believe that, you know, like bringing their products to people is going to be amazing. Netflix is going to change lives. But that's not how reality works. Don't be so naive, please. Like, yes, corporations have a good intention about making psychedelics reachable for everybody. But what's going to happen, actually, is that corporations are going to start becoming greedy. And many of the people who are speaking in these panels are not the ones who are going to be managing those corporations. Are going to be managed by people who are profit-focused and who are going to be very interested in creating apps so that people take MDMA in their own house with an app and subscribe to a system in which they can take MDMA once a month in this app. And I mean, we're going to go into a pretty crazy perspective because we don't know how to put a stop to them. Finally, lack of diversity. Like, look at us, white people everywhere, privileged, middle-class people. Where are gonna be the queer people, like giving therapy to queer people, the black people giving therapy to black people, the poor people that know about being poor, giving therapy to poor people? Like, that's not going to exist in these terms because it doesn't exist in the medicalized system. Psychiatrists are mostly pretty privileged people, and most of the times they don't know how the fuck to treat poor, excluded, culturally traumatized populations. So yeah, those are my fears. I guess.
I just wanted to mention that, so I come from a countercultural, poor, queer background myself. That's my perspective that I come to this stage from. I did my degree as a mature student as a single mother living in a council flat, and I did my academic background is in ecology rather than psychedelics. So that's my position as to why I'm actually, and then I just sort of ended up sucked into the conference world because I really liked it. That's why I'm here. So I'm really, really pleased to be able to communicate with you all here today. It's lovely. And one of the things I wanted while you both were talking there, I was thinking about my friend Torsten Passy, who's been doing psycholytic therapy since the 1980s, where the therapist takes a small dose of psychedelics as well as the actual patient doing this. And one of the things that he told me a couple of years ago was that he'd just been to a conference of psychiatrists where they were trying to work out what the brain imaging of people with different psychiatric disorders, which bit of the brain doesn't work properly. So they had this sort of conference, thousands of people, hundreds of people there, and the grand reveal was that if you look at the brain images of these people that have problems, they look exactly the same. You cannot distinguish between them by looking at a brain image. And this was something that the people the therapists are not surprised by, because they see these people presenting with essentially the same kind of problems, which are mostly to do with social isolation and the way that manifests and reinforces itself. And the thing that was one of the most widely attended talks there was about the way that society needs to change in order for psychiatrists to do their job properly. And the overwhelming swell of opinion at this conference, which was very academic, and was that the psychiatrists understood very definitely and consciously that it's the world that we live in which is messed up, not the chemistry of their patients. And I've took great heart from hearing his story about that. So I just wanted to mention that yes, that is the sort of the model, but that is something that psychiatrists themselves are very much pushing for. There have been a few public statements to that thing as well. Right, sorry, just to sort of like put that in there. But, yeah. So, Ali, what's your dystopian vision?
Oh, I love these.
Go for it, don't hold back.
I'll try not to. Thank you both. That was just wonderful to hear, because I agree with it. So it's always wonderful to hear that. No, but it really was. My dystopian vision. Yeah, so there's a couple of, maybe a little bit of caveats and framing first. I think one really important thing to think about when we're looking at, when we're trying to figure out what might the next 5 or 10 years look like, is that we live in a very complex system, not a complicated. This is a complex problem that we're facing, not a complicated one. The difference is that something complicated is just very difficult, and then if you tinker with the right bits, like, oh, we changed this law, and we changed this thing, and we changed this policy, then we've sorted it. Like, we'll legalize this, and we'll do this, like a grandfather clock, you tinker around. That's not what the world is like, and that's not what we are like as humans. We're complex, which is that we are connected with other systems. We have this quality of emergence where new things arise from the interaction of all these elements. So with that said, this idea that's come up a few times of that there is an ecosystem of different approaches around psychedelics, I think is true, and I think there will be many different expressions of how we access psychedelics. So that's the caveat bit done, and now I'm going to launch into the dystopia. So my fears are, I think, I just want to pick up on something Gabriel said about why aren't we focusing on preventative medicine? Why aren't we focusing on resourcing people and making them healthy? And one thing that came into my head when you said that was, well, because why would we when we don't really know what we're living for in our culture? This is, I think, this has been called the meaning crisis, one of the many crises we're facing, but it's a phrase that's been popularized by John Vervaeke, who's a cognitive scientist at the University of Toronto. But I think this is what keeps coming up for me as I'm looking at this question, the sense that in the West, and I'm speaking very much from a kind of the perspective of weird cultures, as in Western, educated, industrialized, rich and democratic. So, it's a phrase. So, we're all weird here, basically, extremely, in so many ways. But weird cultures, I think we are going through this serious crisis of meaning. In part because of the decline of traditional religion, but not just that, it's also the decline of actually connecting with one another and actually being in community with one another. That is, and there's many, many other factors as well. But that meaning crisis means that when we're asking, how do we solve the mental health crisis? Maybe it's psychedelics. Maybe what's missing is psychedelics. We'll give people psychedelics. That, I think, is a huge fallacy. Because we're not sick because we don't have enough psychedelics. We're sick, as everyone's pointed out, because our culture is atomizing, meaningless, pointless. So what are we getting well for? What do we want to heal the mental health crisis for exactly? What are we going to do when everyone's happy and healed? And Christian Angermeyer has fulfilled his mission of switching everyone on, and we're in some kind of weird utopia where no one has any, or in his view, no one dies anymore as well. But we're in some utopia where everyone's healthy and happy. It's no, that doesn't work unless we change our value system. And so the kind of connecting to a deeper value system and actually going in the process, particularly in the West, of what is worth living for and what is worth dying for. Because it's not going to Westfield and it's not Netflix. We know that. Like most of us really deeply know that these are not the things that are bringing us into connection and happiness, but we don't really know what will. And psychedelics aren't going to be the thing that magically does that. I really do think they can help us with that, because I really do think they are, as Robin, who's on later, and many others have pointed out, they're kind of connecting agents. Right? They can help to deeply connect us to ourselves, to the environment in new ways. But they can also connect us much deeper into the existing system. And that's my dystopian vision, is like 5 or 10 years from now, that, you know, I'm driving down the street and I see a billboard for, hey, feeling blue? Have some LSD. You know, that's like, you know, that I saw a Headspace, I'm really bashing Headspace a lot, I'm sorry if anyone's really a fan of it, but I saw a Headspace billboard a couple of months ago, which was just after New Year's, and it was like, hey, getting back to work, feeling a little bit tired, meditation, and all the other different practices that we've stolen, borrowed from rich, deep traditions, and now we're going to reapply them to being a good citizen in a culture that was making you sick in the first place. That's the thing I'm most afraid of. So. Yes, exactly.
If I take microdose, I can do spreadsheets and I'm much more focus, which doesn't help. I don't try that. So I was speaking with someone yesterday, and we were discussing how the terminology of mental health is all negative. I was saying, are there like words that describe, or phrases that describe positive, or even more than positive, or not just okay kind of ways that people behave, like syndromes or orders rather than disorders? And he said he couldn't think of any at all, which I find deeply distressing, because if we don't have a name for something, how do we know about it, and how do we aim to do it? Like that's one of the things that the mental health industry at the moment, it's a mental illness industry, and it has huge things to do. There are a lot of people that need help for this. We can't reinvent society if we're all like sad and upset, unless we can transform that into an energy that moves things on. But it would be nice to have those positive things that we can reach for, and have that positive phrasing. So with that in mind, I think we might be running into the next break slightly, but that's going to happen if it happens. So yeah, we'll just have a shorter break. So I'd now like to give the panel a chance to go. I'll go in a slightly different order just to mix things up again. So now I'd like us to look at what's the most likely thing that we desire to happen in the next 5 to 10 years. You can let your imagination run wild here, be really optimistic about stuff, go, I want this to happen, and we'll see if the audience here agrees with us. I think we're broadly speaking in the same page, because the people that are here today want to connect physically. That's why they're here. So thank you very much for all turning up. So I think we all sort of come from a certain standpoint on this one, although hopefully we'll get some other voices in the discussion that we have next. But Ali, if I could pass that one to you first. Thank you.
But positive. It's always harder somehow.
It has more variation.
Yes, yeah. I suppose the positive for me would be that we have a healthy psychedelic ecosystem, and so that we do have, of course, a medical expression, and we do have the clinical side of things hugely important, but we also have, and this is my own personal one I really care about, is that we have the spiritual and religious expression of psychedelics being as important as the medical and recreational and any other expressions that we see. Because what we're missing is, I think, a connection to the sacred. I think that's one of the many things, but I think it's one of the key things we're missing in consumer culture. And I think the sacred is, in some schools of sociology, the sacred is anything that we hold up as more important than the day-to-day, more important than money, more important than anything else. And so that, I think, my ideal would be that psychedelics reconnect us in many different ways, because there's not going to be one way that we reconnect to the sacred. It's going to be thousands, millions of different ways, but that they reconnect us to a sense of the sacred deeply enough that we can slow down, as we almost did during the pandemic, and go, maybe this isn't a great way to live. Maybe there are other ways. And then from that, also something Gabriel pointed to, really exploring the different applications, what practices we can combine psychedelics with, what different ways of approaching them beyond just fixing a problem. But you mentioned marriage counseling, creativity, group work. That psychedelics become something that we're using in a very conscious, careful, considered way with a constant dialogue between all the different types of people doing it, of something that can actually give us the new ideas that we need. That for me, and that could look in lots of different ways. There could be clinics and churches and other psychedelics in the International Space Station. Why not, right? So probably not a good idea. But so that it kind of opens out. So we're kind of broadening out into a healthy ecosystem.
Something that I've been interested in recently is the idea of psychedelic chaplaincy. Yeah. So chaplaincy is where someone from a religion or a spiritual path puts that to one side so that they can minister to people of many different faiths and spiritualities, usually in a hospital or prison situation, but it could be another institution. And the lessons that these people who have learnt to speak cross spirituality-wise, the lessons that they've learnt from doing this, they're very keen to explore the psychedelic space and how this has lessons that we can transfer some of the bits of knowledge and the techniques that they have there. So. Yeah.
Got 2 minutes left, haven't I?
I'm good. If you said that's excellent. Gabriel, if I could turn to you next, have you got an optimistic thing to say?
No.
Oh God.
Everything is green. I have been working Mexico is definitely a complex country, and I live in Berlin now, which is the mecca of drug use. So coming into these two dynamics, I've worked as a sweat lodge guide in Mexico for a long time, and now I do that also in Berlin. And I believe a lot in symbolism. So I put always these 4 forces inside the psychedelic world that I call the four elementals, in which the water, it's the therapeutic use of psychedelics. The wind is the recreational use of psychedelics. The fire is the ceremonial religious use of psychedelics. And the earth is kind of like the wellness spa religious use of psychedelics. And I think these 4 forces, what I like, I defend a notion that I created, or maybe, I don't know, that I call psychedelic holisticism, which is the idea that everything should exist. And everyone should support the existence of the other. So for example, therapeutic use, fantastic. Do you feel that you have a mental illness? Have you been traumatized? Do you need mental treatment in a white room with a specific setting? Go for it. Do you want to take psychedelics with highly trained facilitators in a mansion in Costa Rica with an infinity pool? Fantastic. Do you want to take psychedelics in an indigenous setting with people who are supported by the governments of their country, by indigenous knowledge that is actually recognized by the world itself? Go for it. And if you want to take it in the dance floor and get really high while dancing psychedelic trance, please do so. But the idea is that we need to defend all of those uses, always under the parachute, under the umbrella, almost, under the umbrella of harm reduction, and do no harm. I mean, harm reduction, you shall not, we need to educate people, facilitators need to be highly trained, do no harm. We need to create something like a Hippocratic oath in which people actually understand that psychedelics can't be used for sexual approaches, So the 4 universes working together, for me, would create a healthy environment, a healthy ecological environment, because it respects all of the uses. And I mean, in my case, I don't want to take psychedelics in a clinical environment, but I mean, I remember that after Horizon conference in New York, we went with Rick and some other people to this place called the Zero Space. I don't know if any one of you was there. And I was like, wow, it was like this place, that like this club, that every part of the club was constructed for tripping. And I was like, fuck yes, this is the future. I mean, if these kind of spaces start existing for people who want to take, and you know, like you have Psycher there, and people are educated. I come from Berlin, and something that inspires me a lot of Berlin is that since drug use is so, so generalized, people are highly educated about it. I mean, you rarely see people wasted on the floor in the clubs, and sometimes they are dancing for 2-3 days, like, what are you doing? But they really know how to do it, because if you create environments of acceptance, of education, of harm reduction, people will act accordingly. And I believe in that. And the same happens with indigenous populations. They don't want to be isolated. They don't want us to be like, oh, I'm going to respect your sacred knowledge. No, what they want is inclusion. And I've talked with many of them, and they're like, no, please, have you ever asked me what I need? In my master's studies, I studied interculturality, and one of the things that I studied was applying grounded theory in psychedelic studies. Grounded theory is basically the notion of asking, what do you want? Actually, what do you need before I take decisions about what I think you need? And this happens a lot with indigenous populations, where just like, I think you need this. And it's like, no, ask them. Most of the times you would be surprised about their responses. Like, hey, I want a university of indigenous shamanic studies. I have worked with amazing organizations. I'm going to mention some of them. Planet Buyback, Umiyak, Nyerika Institute, Shanahuya. Like, these are institutes founded by indigenous people in which they are actually representing their own knowledge, creating almost their own universities about how to work with sacred plants, with sacred medicines, with botanics, with environment, with animals, with the social being, with rituals. It's fantastic. And if we empower this type of process, if we allow them to happen, to occur, then we would only become richer ourselves. So the idea is precisely supporting each other. This is for me the positive environment, supporting each other. You guys that you are doing like psychedelic research in your offices and you believe that you're changing the world, support recreational use. Don't be scared. Support the ravers. Support the indigenous people. Support. Because if we isolate ourselves and we believe that this one is the good way of using psychedelics, then we're just constricting and separating more and more. And this is exactly what we don't need. That's it.
I guess my utopian vision, what I'm sort of dreaming in, is safe, affordable, legal access to psychedelics for everybody in socially and culturally sensitive ways.
Exactly.
And how we're going to get there, we all need to club together and think about it, because it's a big project to think about, but it's part of what I was doing with ICEAs. Like, how can we create, and actually I'm going to sort of cycle back to the policy angle, because I think it's really crucial. If we want to, the medical thing is happening, but if we want an alternative future, we have to build it alongside. We have to club together, we have to lobby for change, and we have to focus on what we want. And for me, that sort of is really about looking at the source. This microphone's a bit crackly.
That one seems to be...
It's about looking at our source, where we've come from. It's about looking at where we are now and keeping an eye on where we want to get to, on the destination. And so I think, as I was sort of doing this project and looking at all the different policy reform options, and where do we want to go? Medicalization, legalization, decriminalization, is there anything else? Because we've got those three models. And at the moment here we're looking at medicalization because we think that that's going to open the door quickest to the widest possible access. But I'm beginning to think we might have been backing the wrong horse a bit. and that we should have been putting our energy into backing decriminalization. And then this also brings up a point that I don't want this to be, which was one of my fears, is of psychedelic exceptionalism. That somehow our drugs are better than yours, than other drugs. And so when I talk about decriminalization, I'm not talking about just decriminalizing psychedelics, I'm talking about decriminalizing all drugs, stopping people going to jail, for choices they make to alter their consciousness. It just shouldn't be happening anymore. But we're here to talk about psychedelics, so I'll sort of I'll focus in on that one. And, if we decriminalize, it's a bit like what you were saying, Gabriel. We need to do it alongside, we need to get the government behind it. We need to do it alongside harm reduction, safe spaces, better education, so that we create a safety net for any kind of harms that might happen. I mean, I think we need to do that anyway, because there's bound to be some harms that happen from the clinical environment too. And we need to look at decriminalizing not just personal use, but shared use. Because in shared use, you can still have your ceremonies, your rituals, your groups. No one's going to go to jail for having enough LSD to share with their friends. And then you can think about doing something that is happening in Spain, because obviously it's decriminalized there, which is psychedelic social clubs. So they have ayahuasca social clubs in Spain. Small communities, decriminalized shared use. They support each other. And when we're talking about this kind of healing model and what we think, how we think psychedelics can transform, and what I was saying about this individualized approach, we're going to potentiate the medicine and the therapeutic value of these compounds if we build community. And we can build community by asking for decriminalization. We can widen access by asking for decriminalization. And I've kind of gone one step further really in my visioning of this. So you can have psychedelic social clubs, but you could even start thinking and wanting and dreaming, and I think if we dream hard enough, we can make it happen. Psychedelic community centers, bigger scale, where you can go and have your ceremony. The center can twin up with an indigenous integrative, cultural healthcare center in the Amazon somewhere. They can support each other. There can be an educational flow. There can be a partnership, like what you were saying, collaboration, relationship, education, art, raves, parties, We want to think about that kind of thing, like widening it. Because our use has been so persecuted for so long, we sort of went down this very narrow route of, fearful route really, thinking where can we open the door? But let's just try and open it wider. Let's try and make it more inclusive and more accessible to everyone at an affordable price.
In this country which have been set up, which are deliberately flouting the existing laws and which are in fact supported by many police forces because they see cannabis as a problem which is a problem because it's criminalised, and they realise that the actual use and enjoyment, not just use, I'll use the word enjoyment deliberately there, the use and enjoyment of this plant is actually beneficial to society as a wider thing in some areas, not all of them. So now we're going to open up to questions from the floor. We don't have a terribly long time because we need to be on with other things. So go for it. Keep your questions short so that we can get answers from it.
I just think that at what point do we have to get the medical community to be educated in politics? Because, what's happening is systemic, it's political, and, we've got certain individuals getting involved who have ideological backgrounds, Peter Thiel, Robert Mercer, they're basically white supremacists. They believe in great replacement theory. Roe versus Wade was part of it. It's a whole system, and they want to grab the psychedelic space as well. Unless we're actually acknowledging that it exists, does anyone think that the psychiatrists and some of the medical people are just not aware politically?
Yeah, so I think personally I'd answer that just to have a sort of like to take advantage of my position here. I think one of the things that we can do is try and shout louder than them. We can't necessarily stop people with those voices, but it's to make our arguments more attractive. I don't know if there's someone on the panel who would like to...
Yeah, I mean, yeah, Julia, I think it's a really good question. And I think one of the things that comes up for me is, well, I guess first people in the medical community would have to want to do that. And then the other thing is, I think there's a general culture, or has been at least, of not rocking the boat, because everyone's very afraid that psychedelics are going to become illegal again, etc. I think part of it might be stop being afraid of rocking the boat, right? There's nothing less psychedelic than being tentative and afraid that we're going to rock the boat. So I think people in the medical community are in a tremendously privileged position to do that, and should, because I think right now, the cat's out of the bag now. I think it's unlikely that it's going to go back in. So I think we have nothing to lose in that way.
I remember talking with Brian Anderson from the University of San Francisco. He has been conducting clinical trials there in very specific, different, interesting settings. And something that he told me at some point was that he believed that the best therapists that he have ever seen, they were not clinical psychologists or psychiatrists, like the best psychedelic therapists. They were chaplains, they were nurses, they were social workers, because they were more culturally sensitive to the realities of people. And for psychedelics, you need to be fine-tuned with a certain type of compassion, a certain also amount of humbleness, which I don't necessarily see in psychiatrists and clinical psychologists, because actually they fight for years to become someone, and this is exactly what we were talking before. So I think not only political education, but I think what they need is, in a general way, like some spanking, to be honest. Like they need to be like taken down from their high horses and understand that treating mental health is not only their field, it's a field of a lot of people who make efforts to understand these culturally sensitive issues. And there are people who are magnificent at it, and they don't have their titles or whatsoever. So yeah.
I'm going to take a controversial position and defend the clinicians, because while I think it's a great idea ideologically, I'm also very aware that they're still in a delicate position. We're still in the early wave, and I think for them to stand up and fight politically, it might jeopardize not only their position, but the movement. It's a bit like, scientists that have done, like David Nutt can do it now. He could do it. Scientists who have got to a certain position, they could do it. It's a bit like kind of David Attenborough, really. It's taken him until the last 5-6 years to become a real eco-activist and stand up beside Greta. Before that, and even, this long career before that, it was not very controversial in terms of environmental activism. I think it's only once you get to a certain position you can do it. So I'm just going to slightly play devil's advocate there. And activists have a position. Other people in the field can raise their voices.
Mm. Yeah, thank you. This lady here is very keen to have a microphone and ask a question.
Yeah.
So.
Well, hi, I can speak while I guess we're waiting. Speaking as a clinician, I guess the challenge here, you're talking about the early intervention and the lack of early intervention in the field. And actually, the Green Paper has been introduced a lot of not-to-5 services and kind of educating and providing support in schools. And why is this failing? It's failing because there's no staff. Everyone's burning out, and NHS is dealing with massive recruitment and retention issues. And I know it's very well and good to sit and blame kind of apps and pills, but the issue is, especially post-pandemic, that there's a lot of people struggling, and there's not enough people to support them. And I agree with you completely that it's not all down to doctors and psychologists and psychiatrists to support those who are struggling. But on the other hand, you have those who did, a month course online and hugged a plant and consider themselves a life coach. And they destabilize people even more. They escalate to come to the NHS, and it's on our backs. So I think we're very privileged to sit here and think about the future and dream about the wonderful, life. But I'm going to be there on Monday dealing with masses of referrals and not enough staff to be able to hold them. So I guess my question is there anything that we can really do proactively in actually decriminalizing and really doing something, not just talking about it? And yeah, that's the question. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, hello.
Takes a second.
Sorry. So, yeah, hello. I think it's open. I totally agree with you. I think it's incredibly important that people are prepared. And I think one of the main problems that doctors and the health system has is understaffing and lack of funding. And definitely, I mean, in a general way, like mental health is so underfunded in the world that it's hilarious how we are confronting basically one of the biggest crises in history. And governments are like, yeah, that's pretty secondary. It's depressing, to be honest. And I totally agree. I do believe, like, I have some examples. For example, then in Berlin, there's this doctor called Till Kinkel. He fought for years to introduce a drug education and harm reduction system inside the School of Psychiatry and Mental Health in the Charité Hospital. I think these are the efforts, and I think these efforts should be coordinated and should be supported. Like I do believe that creating networks of people being like, hey, how are your results? Give me maybe your programs. Maybe we can culturally sensitively check if they work in the place where I'm working at. And I think we need to propose and to go out to the streets. And I think that if all the people that are here came out to the streets of London with, I don't know, T-shirts saying like legalize drugs, I think that would already make some impact. And I do believe that we can do it. I mean, psychedelic exceptionalism, yes, it's a problem because we actually need to talk about all drugs. And I think that if we are able to do that, then the cannabis world, the harm reduction psychoactive world and the psychedelic world coming together to talk and demand drug decriminalization, that would be a massive success. So yeah, become political, I think.
I just want to add very briefly, say thank you for that, because I think it's a very good point. And I think the problem isn't located in everyone in the NHS and other services who are working extremely hard. I suppose you're, in some sense, working with the symptoms of perhaps the various different systemic problems that we've been talking about. But I think one of the question of how can we do things practically, I think often, it's kind of what Gabriel was saying, often it's about the stories we're telling culturally. So actually media, art, different people who've taken psychedelic, like actually bringing it to life in a way that people can connect to and really understand. And that's happening more and more. It's often overlooked because it's a bit hazy and culture sort of emerges naturally, but it's a bit like Terence McKenna said, it's about making our own culture. So yeah, walking out with a legalized t-shirts, but also telling stories, making art, about what it really means. So.
Yes, sort of normalizing this.
I'll just answer the practical question, really. There are obviously organisations in the UK who are campaigning for decriminalisation. So there's Transform Drug Policy Foundation, you can get behind them. There's the Beckley Foundation, who are also doing policy reform. There's Release, and as Ali said, the telling of the stories, one of the things that I got told when I was doing this research on policy reform, and I asked, what made a difference? What was successful in your communication strategy? And people said, they led with the science. So that's the thumbs up to the science crew here. They led with the science and then told personal stories and then shared the history of the movement. And that, if you do that and you spread the stories and you share your personal experiences, little by little, we'll push that door open a little bit wider.